Hello, everybody, and welcome to OSACon 25. It is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Heather Meeker. She will be talking about how open source businesses will thrive in the age of AI. I want to just say a couple words about Heather's background. We've known each other for many years. It's been a pleasure to work with her, and there are a lot of opinions, a lot of hot air around open source licensing and the relationship between open source and business. Heather is the real thing. So she has written licenses, she's participated extensively in litigation to defend them in court, and she's familiar with virtually every aspect of how open source and the legal frameworks underneath it relate to businesses. Without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Heather. Welcome, Heather.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be talking here today, particularly about this topic, which is one of my favorite topics. So let's just go ahead and get started on this. I'm going to talk today about how open source businesses will thrive in the age of AI. I would say that for the past few years, I've really become a booster for starting businesses around open source projects. And there's been a lot of churn, at least in the press, about how AI will affect that. And I'm very happy to be talking about that today. So let's start out by understanding what we mean by open source businesses, because people get really confused about this, but it's pretty simple. We sometimes refer to these kinds of businesses as COSS businesses, or commercial open source software businesses. Of course, it doesn't mean that the business is open source, but what it means is that the products and services of the business are created surrounding a specific open source project. So the difference between that and what a lot of companies do is, like, everybody uses open source software these days. That doesn't make you a COSS business. What makes you a COSS business is when your very business is centered around an open source project. And there are a lot of people who wonder whether that's really possible, which is weird because they've had so much success already. So let's talk a little bit about what this means. If you go to maybe the old school of open source development, you have a model which is basically volunteers creating open source projects. So step back for a moment and ask, if you have an open source project, how do you make it economically sustainable? And we all know this is very important, because when models become something other than sustainable, they become insecure, or they die an ignominious death, or they die a very famous death, which is not good. So historically, open source was a hobbyist thing, but what I need to point out is what that meant is not that they required no resources to run. It meant that people were volunteering and using their own personal resources to sustain the product. That's why I call it sweat equity. So sometimes people ignore the fact that in order to make an open source project sustainable on a volunteer or community basis, there are people who are spending their own personal resources, and they get burnt out. They have to take time away from the rest of their lives, or in pure economic terms, they're devoting time to the project that they could otherwise devote to something that would pay them. So it's not that that's a costless model. It's just that it's a volunteer model. And then another way that projects have historically been sustained economically is via public funding. So that might mean a government grant. It might mean that the project is hosted by an academic institution and so forth. But again, that doesn't mean it's costless. It just means the money is coming from a particular source. So these are sort of the old school ways of doing things. But one of the newer way of doing things is to sustain projects economically through private investment. And so when I talk about a COSS business, what I'm talking about is basically a privately funded business. And that usually means that it's got some investors, and those investors might range from, small friends and family investors to venture investors, all the way up to like private equity and so forth. Now, here's the thing about COSS businesses, and this is what I've been stumping around on my bandwagon about for the last few years, is that from the point of view of investors, they're actually fantastic investments. And this is the point that I've been trying to educate people about lately. There are many good reasons why they're good investments. First, they're incredibly capital efficient. I mean, if you start a business around an open source project, you have all sorts of advantages around, not spending too much on human resources. So COSS businesses are often virtual businesses. And by the way, they've been that way since way before the pandemic. So they had a real jump on that kind of cost savings. There is also the ability to get a lot of attention without spending a lot of money on marketing. So the branding aspect of COSS businesses is usually very good. COSS businesses don't usually spend a lot of money on advertising or even professional sales. A lot of the advancement of the reputation of their products and services comes through word of mouth in the community. I mean, we all know that when developers find a good tool, particularly an open source tool, they like to talk about it, and words can spread very quickly about it. So that means the business doesn't have to spend a lot of money on those things, whereas in a typical enterprise software business, those things are really quite expensive to accomplish. The other thing that's great about COSS businesses is that they have what we call a very high consumer surplus. What that means is that the business generates a huge amount of value, but it doesn't necessarily monetize all that value. So the people who are using the open source software get a lot of value out of it, and the business will monetize some of that. But the amount of value that's created is more than just what the business is getting. And that means that's just adding to the surplus of society. It's an economic term, but it basically means utility, enjoyment of the world, right? Also, it's easier to sell COSS products because they have better characteristics regarding business continuity. We can maybe almost not even remember the days when enterprise software, for instance, was sold in binary form only, and we had to do software escrows and so forth. Today, when you sell an enterprise software product or service, the assumption is that customers will get access to software. And that means if the business goes south, they can, it's never easy, but they can go forward maintaining the open source software on their own. So this is a very, very quick TLDR slide about what these advantages are. And if you want to learn more about how this works, I invite you to visit Chinstrap Community. So Chinstrap Community is a resource center that I started with a partner. It's been less than a year since we started it, which is amazing because we've gotten so much done in the meantime. But everything's free. It's information. We have workshops, we have articles, we have news, and so forth. And so if this type of business is of interest, please go and look at Chinstrap Community and see if there's anything useful to you there. So that's kind of point one, which is there are these things called COSS businesses, and they are extremely attractive businesses. To prove the point, there are a lot of really successful COSS businesses already. People still ask me pretty regularly, how do you make money with open source? How is that even possible? And the fact is, it's not only possible, I think it's the wave of the future. I think that the COSS business is eating the software business the same way open source ate software generally. If you want to see some information about this, Chinstrap Community publishes a database about COSS businesses, and you can see an example here on the screen. This is a little bit outdated, but we keep a running tab, at least for the companies that are already in our database, which are by no means all of them, by the way, about total funding and valuation of COSS as a sector. And as you can see, even our little sliver that we have tracked down so far has a valuation of over $250 billion. So that's doing very well. And it's the answer to, wait a minute, it isn't possible to make money with COSS businesses, is it? By the way, if you know of a company that's not on our database, which is called Cosmology, please, there's a form to submit it. So if you're starting a business around open source, please go ahead and submit it. We'd love to have you in our database as well. And by the way, we're working on an effort to make this a little more open sourcey in terms of how it's maintained. So stay tuned for that. Okay, so now we have to understand how these businesses work. And again, this is a TLDR version, but a lot of people have some difficulty kind of doing the mental gymnastics to figure out how this works, but it's really not that difficult. And by the way, this metaphor is one that I have completely stolen from Bob Young, who was one of the founders of Red Hat. And Bob is a wonderful guy, and he is a consummate salesman, and he explains how open source businesses work with this very simple metaphor. So here's how it works. Suppose you want a car, and I told you that I would give you this car for free, the one in the picture. And would you take it for free? And the answer is no, you would not take it for free. Okay, so why don't you want this car? Well, this car has been, it is an unassembled car. These are all the pieces for the car, but the car has not been put together. So if you took all these pieces to the car, you would have to assemble them on your own. And the fact is, you probably wouldn't know how to do that. But even if you did know how to do it, you might not want to do it. Maybe you just don't have the time or inclination. But also, there would be some problems. If you put the car together on your own, you might not legally be able to drive it in some places. Also, you might not be able to get anyone to service it. Also, it might not work if you end up with a few extra nuts and bolts. So here's the thing about COSS businesses. People don't pay for software, for source code. Source code is not a product. Source code is a tool to make a product. And what open source provides is essentially software, right? And so essentially source code. So if you have the source code, it doesn't mean you have the product. When people buy software, whether it's on-premises software, SaaS, managed software, etc., what they're buying is a product that works, and so that they can solve problems in their business. And this exploded car is not what they want. They want the car that runs like a top, and what's more, probably comes with some kind of warranty that it will keep running for a certain amount of time. So what open source COSS businesses are selling is the delta between the exploded car and the put together car. Okay. There are many types of business models that work in COSS. I won't go into them in detail. Again, if you want more information, take a look at ChinChat community because there's tons of information there. But they basically run from open core, which is the core software is open source, and then there are add-ons that are sold, to SaaS, which is the open source software is available for on-premises use, but you have to pay for SaaS, and dual licensing, which is not as common these days, but that's kind of the old MySQL model where you have a choice of, say, GPL, which is a copyleft or share-alike license. And if you want to buy your way out of those obligations, you can pay extra money for an alternative license. So these models have developed over the last 10 to 20 years, and they are becoming much more mature now. There are also tons of other ways of making money around open source software. You can provide maintenance and support, professional services, but there are also interesting models around, say, content. And the example on this slide is Blue Sky, which has open source technology, but the content is what is valuable to people. So there are many, many ways to approach cost business models, and they depend on exactly what kind of product you're selling. And finally, I will stop, get off my soapbox in a moment, but COSS is now in all sectors. If you asked about cost businesses maybe 15 years ago, people would say, well, it works in infrastructure like Red Hat, but it doesn't really work for anything else. Well, today it works throughout the stack. You've got extremely successful cost businesses in infrastructure like Red Hat, in middleware like Redis or Confluent, and in applications like Grafana. So there really isn't any limitation anymore as to where in the stack that you can be. And it's also in all sorts of business sectors. Okay, so that's sort of the basis of what's a cost business and how does it work. So we had to answer that question in order to talk about how AI is going to affect software, because it is extremely integrated with understanding that aspect. So you ask people, how is AI going to affect software first? And this is what most people think. Software is dead. It's going to die because of AI. By the way, this is an AI-generated model of the death of software. So that little device on the gravestone presumably is not an actual symbol of anything. It's not intended to be. But you have certainly heard and read the same things that I have about how coding is going to die and software, as human instructions, is going to die. By the way, the press loves saying things like this, but of course, it is absolutely and categorically untrue. Okay, so why are they saying this? Well, this is their idea of what AI and software is. They think that somebody, like a baby, can sit down and do some vibe coding and come up with some software that works and that people are going to like using. And vibe coding is great. I've done it. It's very interesting, saves a lot of time. It's really great. But if you think you're going to come up with products that people will actually buy by vibe coding, then you've got another think coming. This is not how it works. You can generate code with AI, but putting it into a product that people will actually buy. Again, think about that delta between the exploded car and the drivable car. That is what people are paying for, and AI has not changed that aspect of it one bit. In fact, if there's a better metaphor for what AI is doing to software, and by the way, I took this from a thumbnail for a video, a guy who does videos. I don't even know who this guy is, but I just love the expression. It's like, okay, now we have all these new wonderful tools that we could use. This is super awesome. And we are going to absolutely put a rocket booster under what we are able to do as far as software goes. What's really going to happen is, I think this may be the Venn diagram that is maybe represents today, but if we talk again in a few years, these circles are going to be almost coincident, and I'll explain a little bit about why. Okay, so open source software, which we all know and love and is enormously successful, is absolutely crucial in AI. In fact, AI isn't going to get rid of open source. AI is going to create a cavernous demand for open source software. So why is that? Because you need a lot of software in order to deploy AI. So when you deploy an AI model, there are a whole lot of artifacts that are not machine learning. They are a whole bunch of other things, like you need development tools to create AI. You also have to have software that will manage things like checking for bias, checking for safety, checking for accuracy, and so forth. So all of this stuff that surrounds AI models, when people actually use them, those things are software, and they kind of have to be human. Well, they have to be human curated, and a lot of them are human generated. You cannot deploy the AI models that everybody is talking about without a whole ton of software. There's a huge software stack that you need in order to do it. The machine learning models are only part of the stack. You have training and testing software, and then you have the models, right? And then you have user interface, which is usually code. You have orchestration tools. In other words, like, I'm using this term to mean if you ask an AI a prompt, it will, the sophisticated ones will now go and check various models to try to figure out which is the best one to answer your question, or maybe put them together. Monitoring to see how the system is doing, either for technical reasons or other reasons. Input and output screening. So if you're using AI in an organization, an enterprise, you may want to disallow people from putting certain information into the AI. You may want certain kinds of output not to go to the users. And we've seen a lot of examples about that in the media lately, about potentially harmful content. And then automated machine learning, which chooses models and reduces compute time. So of all of these, the models it's like the second bullet point. I put them kind of in time order, but the rest of that is actually software. And what's more, it's open source software. It is absolutely open source software. So if you look, for instance, at the training software, it is overwhelmingly open source. And that is no surprise, because open source software is basically eating the world. So that we put that all together, and what it means is that AI is going to actually be a huge motivator of more open source software. It will also increase open source development. So this is a point that, to be honest, a lot of projects are struggling a little bit with these days, but it will, how to do it will sort itself out. AI will lower the barrier to understanding complex code bases. You can have it analyze code bases for you in order to understand them better. It can automate routine coding tasks. It can help with documentation and code reviews. And by the way, we all know that open source software, there's a lot of open source software that is not very well documented, and AI can help generate documentation or help people query documentation and make it better. And it also can help enabling non-experts to make meaningful contributions. This is another one of my soapbox points. If you're running an open source project and you want to make it better, one of the best things you can do is to help enable non-coders to participate in your project. when you do that, you open the doors to a whole bunch of input that you wouldn't normally have. And there are plenty of meaningful contributions they can make. And AI can actually help them do that. For instance, understanding the code base and so forth. The downside, I mentioned that open source projects are struggling with this somewhat, is that there are a bunch of slop contributions that are coming up, and there is, people are trying to figure that out now. They haven't figured it out yet, but there will be an ongoing issue with ensuring the quality of contributions. Okay, so now let's ask the question, how do you make money with AI? Because we asked the question, how do you make money with open source? We know there are perfectly doable ways to do that. And so how is AI going to affect this? Well, here's a weird thing, and you heard a little bit about this in the last presentation, by the way, but AI is a little weird because it is quickly becoming commoditized. It's following a somewhat unusual pattern in that the most cutting edge technology is becoming the most commoditized right away. So AI is an amazing technological advance, but then you have to ask the question, are businesses who are developing AIs getting high, what we would call monopoly rents in an economic point of view from developing them? They're hugely expensive to develop. And the question is, can you monetize them enough to make them viable from an economic point of view? And so actually, they're not. And although there's tons of investment going into AI, there is not a ton of profit coming out of it yet. Now, businesses do need time to figure out how to monetize things, but actually what we're seeing in AI is something very similar to what we saw in the development of COSS businesses. Open source is the definition of commoditization. You heard this in the last presentation. The value of digital goods is driving towards zero. And the reason, I'll say it again, is that is not what you're selling people. You're selling people usable products. The open source businesses are thriving despite commoditization. So they've figured out how to make money and how to monetize things other than the source code itself. And AI businesses may need to follow that same path if they are also going to be successful. So these things, I think, are going to dovetail so that AI is actually going to fuel open source businesses, because open source businesses may be already running the business model that AI businesses are going to have to run in order to be economically sustainable. So that's my prepared comments. By the way, a little plug for me. First, go to Chinstrap community. All the stuff there is free. Please join our community, take a workshop, read some stuff. We have a Discord server, and talk to us about it, because this is our favorite topic. If you want to read an old-fashioned book about it, I have a book about it that's available on Amazon called From Project to Profit. And that is it for my prepared remarks. And I'm happy to talk about some questions, or I am going to join the air meet right after this talk and stick around for a little while to answer some more questions.
Heather, I believe we have time for at least 2 questions. If you can hear me, here's the first one. So intellectual property can disappear from software. The code is generated, perhaps the spec, but the code itself is not deterministic. This seems like a paradox. Any comment on this?
Well, I hope I'm understanding the question correctly, but this may sound weird coming from someone who is essentially an intellectual property lawyer, but people tend to overvalue intellectual property. Intellectual property is a tool for building and protecting a business, but it is not an end in itself. Nobody pays you for intellectual property unless you're selling patents to a patent troll. The fact is that businesses that create intellectual property really make money creating products. And while intellectual property is a useful tool to prevent competitors from like stealing stuff from you, or it can be, it's actually quite expensive and difficult to enforce. And most companies never bother enforcing their intellectual property. They get a kind of a baseline protection from it, but then they focus most of their resources on making products. So if we looked, theoretically at a world where there was no copyright in software, and I hear people today saying this is the death of copyright in software, and I would just ask the question, how bad will that be? Because people are not paying for your copyright. What they're paying for is your product. And I think that's what the COSS business sector has shown us, is that the IP is not really that valuable on its own. The IP is just a means to get to an end, which is to get a market mover advantage. And that is what most businesses need.
There is a follow-on question, and very simple one then, since you brought up the copyright. The U.S. Copyright Office has issued somewhat confusing guidance on when generated software generated by AI can be copyrighted. Do you have any comments on that beyond what you've just said that would serve as guidance for practitioners?
For legal practitioners, I think that we're really in the infancy of this, but what's going on at this point is if you file a copyright registration, you have to disclose the nature of authorship. And I have not honestly seen many good models as to how to do that. By the way, copyright registrations are things that most people never bother doing before they actually file a lawsuit. Mm-hmm. So it's not like it's a thing that people are struggling with every day of the week. But if you file a copyright registration, you have to tell the nature of your authorship. So if you wrote the thing on your own, then you're the author. If you wrote it with someone else, you would disclose the other person's the nature of their authorship. Is the same way with AI. You have to disclose what you did with AI. And I think anybody who is going to file a registration, they need to think carefully about how to do that disclosure. Because once you try to enforce your copyright, the defendant the first thing they'll do is attack your registration. And the reason I'm focusing on registration is that the guidance of the Copyright Office is about registration. Mm-hmm. The courts will determine how much copyrightable interest people will have in code. And I would not doubt that interest is going to be diluted as more and more code gets generated by AI. So I'm not sure that unclear guidance from the Copyright Office is a real problem at this point. But if you're doing a registration, you should really be looking into the latest and greatest best practices, because I don't actually know of any models out there, or I would point them to you. If the next time I do a copyright registration for a client, which is something I do fairly rarely, by the way, I would need to educate myself about what's the way to do that.
Great. Heather, thank you for an absolutely wonderful talk. We're out of time for questions. Heather will be online in AirMeet if you have further questions. We look forward to seeing you again at a future conference. Thank you, everybody, and thanks again, Heather.
Thank you.